Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about the continuing impact on the global economy of the war in Iran. Now, over the last few months, we've been discussing lots of things such as rising oil prices, higher natural gas prices, supply chain disruption, shipping problems, and the increasing costs being faced by businesses all around the world. And all of those things would normally point towards one outcome: higher inflation, higher prices, and consumers paying more for pretty much everything. But something interesting appears to be happening. While inflation is rising again in many countries, businesses in Europe seem to be responding very differently to businesses in the United States. In America, more of the higher costs have been feeding through into prices. Consumers are now paying increasingly more for their bills, but in Europe, many companies appear to be absorbing a much larger share of the cost themselves. And that raises a very interesting question. Why? Why are European businesses reacting differently? Why are they choosing to absorb these higher costs rather than simply passing them on to consumers? And perhaps more importantly, what happens if they continue doing this? Because according to a fascinating piece of analysis done by Reuters, where they've reviewed almost 200 earnings calls from major European companies, we may be witnessing the early stages of something that could have significant consequences for profits, investment, jobs, and economic growth. In other words, what we're seeing may not simply be an inflation story, it may be a price shock. Now, before we go into the details of all of this, could I ask anybody that hasn't subscribed yet to please hit that red subscribe button? It really does help me with the algorithm. Also, give me a thumbs up for this video whilst you're there, please. That would basically help me do better and also put a smile on my face. Now, let's take a look at what's happening. Reuters recently analysed 175 earning calls from major European companies to understand how businesses are responding to the latest surge in costs as a result of the conflict in the Middle East. And the findings are really quite surprising. More than half of the companies reviewed reported higher costs associated with the conflict, higher energy costs, higher transportation costs, higher fuel costs, higher logistics costs, higher raw material prices. In short, businesses are definitely feeling the impact. However, only around 1/3 of those companies said they were increasing prices. Now, if we compare that to what happened after Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, back then, almost 2/3 of companies responded by increasing prices directly. So something has clearly changed. The question is, what? And I think the answer lies with consumers. Consumers today are very different from consumers back in 2022. Back then, inflation was already accelerating and virtually everybody was raising prices. Consumers had little choice but to absorb those increases. Today, many households are still suffering from the consequences of that period. Food prices remain significantly higher than they were a few years ago. Mortgage costs are elevated. Rents have risen. Utility bills are still far above historic norms, and disposable income remains under pressure. The European Central Bank has actually carried out research suggesting that consumers have effectively been scarred by the inflation shock of recent years. People now notice price increases much more quickly, and they react much more aggressively. In simple terms, people have had enough. Businesses know this, and they're worried. They're worried that if they increase prices, consumers will simply stop buying. They're worried about losing market share, they're worried about losing sales volumes, and they're worried that weaker demand could cause even bigger problems than higher costs. But that's only part of the story. The really interesting aspect of all of this is the contrast with the USA, because the USA and Europe are taking very different approaches to exactly the same problem. At the start of this year, inflation in the USA was running around 2.4%. By April, it had risen to almost 4%. Now, that's a significant increase in a very short period of time. So the cost shock is clearly feeding through into the American economy. Consumers are increasingly paying more. The inflation numbers tell us that. And despite some signs of slowing demand, many large American companies continue to report healthy profits. So in the USA, a larger share of the burden appears to be falling on consumers. However, Europe looks very different. Inflation is rising as well. In fact, inflation has increased significantly from the lows seen earlier this year, but it remains below where economists expected it to be given the increase in energy prices. And that appears to be because European companies are absorbing a much larger share of the pain themselves. So, why is this happening? Well, there are several possible explanations. Firstly, European growth was already weak before the Iran war started. Many businesses were already concerned about slowing demand. Secondly, European consumers appear to be more sensitive to inflation after the experiences of 2022 and 2023. And thirdly, many companies fear that aggressive price increases could result in the loss of customers through competitors. But whatever the reason, the outcome is clear. The USA is allowing more of the costs to flow through to consumers. Europe is allowing more of the costs to flow through to businesses. Now, at first glance, that sounds like good news. After all, if consumers aren't paying, then surely that's positive for all of us. Well, not necessarily, because economics is very simple. Costs don't just simply disappear. If oil prices rise, if transportation costs go up, if shipping costs increase, if energy costs are exploding, somebody has to pay. And there are really only four possible destinations for those costs: either consumers, or businesses, or governments, or shareholders. At the moment, consumers are pushing back. Governments are already struggling with enormous debt burdens, which means businesses and shareholders are increasingly carrying the burden. And that creates a completely different set of economic problems because lower profits have consequences. If a company earns less profit, it has less money available to invest, less money available to expand, less money available to hire workers, less money available to develop new products, less money available to build new factories, and less money available to pay taxes. This is why I think this story is much bigger than just the inflation angle. This is becoming a growth story, a profitability story, and potentially a stagflation story, because we're increasingly seeing the worst possible combination emerge. Costs are rising, demand is weakening, and pricing power is disappearing. You think about that from the perspective of a business owner. Your fuel costs rise, your transportation costs go up, your energy costs are increasing, but your customers won't pay more. And if you increase prices, you risk losing sales. And that's a very difficult position to be in. And it explains why so many companies appear to be absorbing these higher costs for now. But that's the key phrase here, for now, because companies are not charities. They can absorb higher costs for a quarter, maybe 2 quarters, maybe even 3 quarters, but they can't do it forever. Eventually, something has to give. Either prices rise or profits fall. And if profits continue to fall, management teams start making difficult decisions. Investment projects get delayed, expansion plans get cancelled, recruitment slows, hiring freezes appear, and eventually jobs can come under pressure. What's also interesting is that inflation appears to be moving in the wrong direction across most of the Western world. In America, inflation has accelerated significantly this year. In the Eurozone, inflation has risen sharply from the lows seen at the start of 2026. And in the UK, the Bank of England has warned that inflation could move higher again if energy prices remain elevated. At the moment, inflation is being protected slightly because the UK government has put a price cap onto energy prices, but that will be going up. So the cost shock is clearly real. The costs are entering the system. The question is not whether they exist, the question is where they ultimately end up. And I think that's the most important takeaway from today's video. Everybody is looking at inflation, everybody is looking at consumer prices, but very few people are asking where the costs have gone. The answer appears that they've moved onto company balance sheets. The costs haven't disappeared, the pain has simply been transferred. And that may explain why growth forecasts are being revised lower, while inflation remains stubbornly elevated. The first inflation shock following Russia's invasion of Ukraine was largely paid for by consumers. This second shock appears to be landing on businesses, but somebody has to pick up that bill. And over the next few months, we're going to discover exactly who's picking up the burden of this price shock. Will consumers eventually pay through higher prices? Will businesses continue absorbing the cost through lower profits? Will growth slow significantly? Will investment fall? Will employment come under pressure? Those are the questions investors, governments, and central bankers are now desperately trying to answer, because while inflation may appear lower than expected today, that doesn't necessarily mean the problem has gone away. It may simply mean the consequences haven't appeared yet. And that, in my view, is the real story behind the price shock. So I'll keep you posted on any further news and developments, but hopefully you found today's video useful, informative, and most importantly, thought-provoking. If you have liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already.